Emma of Normandy, a Norman noblewoman who would go on to become Queen of England not once but twice, as well as Queen of Norway and Denmark. Unlike most of her contemporaries, Emma would go on to become one of the most visually seen and recorded queens in medieval history. Emma, who was also known as Aelfgifu in England, was born in the early 980s, most likely in Rouen. Her father was Richard the Fearless, Duke of Normandy, and her mother was his second wife Gunnar, who herself came from Norman and Danish families. Duke of Normandy seems to have been the preferred title of Emma's father in political documents, but he is also sometimes known as the Count of Rouen, and even sometimes used the title Marquis. The title for the holder of the Duchy of Normandy was still fluid at this point. Whatever the preferred title of her father, Emma came from a powerful and wealthy family. While we know very little of Emma's upbringing, knowledge of her parents gives some context for how her early years and experiences may have shaped her personality. Gunnar arranged marriages for her sister and nieces to many prominent noble Norman families, connecting them further and strengthening the lands of Normandy into a single family tree. No doubt Emma was aware of these marriages, and this, along with the marriages her father had made, must have instilled in her the idea that marriage was a political tool. Her mother Gunnar was also politically active, attesting ducal charters, accompanying her sons in later life for events, acting as a judge and arbitrator, and even being regent of Normandy in her husband's absence. This must also have made a great impression on the young Emma, watching her mother take charge when her father was absent, and understanding how a woman could take part in the courtly world of politics, even if she wasn't officially meant to be there. Her father had some tension with Ethelred II, the King of England, also known to history as the Unready. After some Viking attacks on England that ended with the marauding Danes using Normandy as a base, the Pope brokered a peace treaty between Richard and Ethelred in around 990 or 91. The peace seems to have held, but after Richard's death in 996, Vikings began attacking England again in the late 10th century, and by the year 1000, they were selling their loot in Normandy. Richard's son, Richard II, welcomed the Danes into his lands, prompting a violent response from Ethelred. Ethelred led an attack on the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy, with orders that Richard II be bound and captured. The Norman cavalry was rapid enough in responding to the threat and repelled the English forces, but something still had to be done to improve relations. Instead of simply brokering another peace treaty, Richard suggested a marriage. Ethelred's first wife, Aelfgifu of York, had died some time before 1002, possibly in childbirth. As a result, he was now a widower, and Richard had unmarried sisters. He offered up his sister Emma, and Ethelred agreed to the match. Little is known of what Emma thought of this marriage, or even if she agreed to it, but in the spring of 1002, she made her way to England to become queen. Emma would also become known in England as Aelfgifu, taking on the name of her predecessor, perhaps in a mark of continuity. Even less is known of the relationship the pair had. The only light shone on this matter is by William of Malmesbury, who remarked that they were not on good terms with each other. But for Emma, who had watched her parents strategizing and political maneuvering, this may have been of little interest. This was, after all, an important political marriage. But Emma at least fulfilled the basic duties of a queen by giving birth to 2 sons, Edward, later to be known as the Confessor, Alfred, and a daughter, Goda. But Emma also made her mark not only by succeeding in bringing 3 children into the world, but also by becoming more politically known at court than Aelfgifu of York had been. Unlike Ælfgifu, Emma was immediately prominent as a witness to Ethelred's charters from the moment she arrived at court. It is an interesting question as to whether her prominence was part of the agreement for her marriage. Ethelred's mother was the formidable Ælfrida of Devon, who had made herself powerful politically, so it is strange that his first wife Ælfgifu is almost invisible during their marriage. It's possible that while Ethelred later relied on his mother as a support to his throne, he did not think it was really somewhere a woman should be, or perhaps he simply wanted to ensure his power was his own. Whatever the truth, Emma was not going to be as silent. However, she wasn't able to gain any preferential treatment for her two sons over Ethelred's other sons. This might seem obvious after the hundreds of years of inherited monarchy across Europe, but in the Anglo-Saxon period of England, this was still a nebulous concept, and a monarch's eldest son, while often chosen by the Witan, wasn't guaranteed a place on the throne. However, Ethelred had been a younger son of his father through a second wife, and his place on the throne had been gained only on the mysterious death of his elder half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. Perhaps he wanted to ensure the certainty of his eldest son gaining the throne and preventing any family squabbles. It also would have been normal in Normandy for the eldest son to be shown preference over sons from a second marriage. Still, it shows that Emma was ambitious for the futures of her own sons. Some of the tension between Emma and Ethelred could also have been caused when in 1002, Ethelred ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. Before his marriage to Emma, Ethelred had, alongside a range of military measures, paid off the Danes attacking his lands with gold and silver. At times this had worked, at others it hadn't. But part of this was Ethelred also paying Viking mercenaries to defend his kingdom against other Vikings. Doesn't really seem in hindsight that it was a good decision, but Ethelred obviously felt he had no other choice. Tension built between Anglo-Saxon settlers, Anglo-Danish settlers, and Danes who were mercenaries for Ethelred. One of the most significant of these was Paleg Tokson, who may have later become the Ealdorman of Devonshire, although there is little evidence for this. It wasn't long before he switched sides and began to take part in raids along the south coast. This, along with many other mercenaries who turned on their employer, was the trigger for Ethelred ordering a massacre of all Danes in England. While it's unlikely this would have actually been possible due to the numbers, and was probably really centred on the mercenary Danes rather than Anglo-Danish settlers, it also became a vent for the xenophobia that was growing in England and Europe at that time. In Oxford, a town well under Ethelred's control, bodies have been found of several young Danish men, both newly arrived and Anglo-Danish, who were brutally killed while escaping from the local church, which had been set on fire with them inside. Many more may have perished inside the church. This was an attack on defenceless people running away from being slaughtered. Near Weymouth in Dorset, bodies were also found of 54 Danish men who had been beheaded in a mass execution that may have been connected to the massacre. But the most damaging death was of a woman called Gunhild, the wife of Paleg Tokson, who was also killed. This was because many historical records state Gunhild was also the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Whether Gunhild really was Sweyn Forkbeard's sister or not, this, plus the killing of other Danes, was the likely catalyst for the Danish king deciding to set his sights on England. Ethelred set off a conflict that would last for more than 10 years and would culminate in a Danish king taking the throne of England. As Emma's mother was partly Danish, it's also likely this caused some conflict within the relationship of the royal couple, but sadly, we have no records of what Emma actually thought. Sweyn Forkbeard launched a series of raids into England, stepping up each attack until 1013, when he launched an invasion of England with the intent of crowning himself as king. The English forces had been decimated and exhausted by constant attacks, and the Danish king took advantage of this. Facing the very real prospect of being killed or captured, Emma and her 2 sons fled to the protection of her brother Richard in Normandy in the same year. Ethelred at first tried to hold off Sweyn, ironically with an army partly made up of Danes led by Thorkel the Tall, who had once led raids on England, who would later change sides again. But Sweyn's forces proved too much, and Ethelred escaped to Normandy shortly after Christmas, leaving Sweyn Forkbeard to become King of England in December 1013. It seemed as though all was lost, but it was to be one of the shortest reigns for a monarch, as Forkbeard was King of England for just 5 weeks, dying on the 3rd of February 1014. The Danes who had come over with Sweyn immediately pledged their loyalty to his son Cnut, but the English nobles, who for the most part had felt no choice but to bow to Sweyn against his military might, instead said they wanted Ethelred. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles stated, "They determined to send for King Ethelred, and they said that no lord was dearer to them than their natural lord, if he would govern them more justly than he did before." Ethelred sent his son Edward back with a group of messengers, attempting to calmly engage with them, replying that he would reform everything they hated and that no one would be punished for going against him previously. The royal family returned to England in the spring, and almost immediately ecclesiastical legislation was drawn up for the new reforms. Archbishop Wulfstan famously preached a sermon asking the English to mend their ways and return to the Christianity of King Edgar's time. Ethelred even managed to drive Cnut and his forces from England's shore upon his return. The return of Ethelred also raised the profile of his eldest son, Aethelstan, who began to build good relationships with his father, brothers, and various thanes in the kingdom. Everything seemed to be going well, except that tragedy was about to befall the royal family more than once. On the 25th of June 1014, Aethelstan died. This was tragic, but little matter for the running of the country, as the king still had other sons. Edmund, now his eldest surviving son, became the next probable successor. But soon, a complicated situation would arise. Eadrig Striona, the ealdorman of Mercia, murdered the thanes Sigfurth and Morcar at a great assembly at Oxford. They had been 2 nobles who had sided with Sweyn Forkbeard, and despite King Ethelred's promises, were killed for their part in events. Edmund had been close to the 2 thanes, but King Ethelred seized their property and held Sigfurth's widow, Ealdgith, at Malmesbury. Edmund then went against his father's will, taking Sigfurth's widow and marrying her, before going to the East Midlands and taking the lands previously held by Sigfurth and Morcar for himself. This has been interpreted as a revolt against his father, but many historians now have an alternative opinion, that Edmund was possibly actually acting against Eadrig Striona. Eadrig had been the king's main advisor for the past 3 years, and it may have been that the actions at Oxford and events since were his doing, and Edmund was perhaps trying in desperation to work against him. Whatever the case, Cnut returned to England in 1016 and found the situation to his advantage. On his father's death, Cnut's elder brother Harold had become king of Denmark. Cnut was eager to find a kingdom of his own, and England, still divided, looked like a good shout. When Cnut went into Mercia via Wessex, Eadrig defected from the English and joined the Danes, leaving Edmund and Ethelred to resolve their difficulties, facing the oncoming army together from London. but Ethelred would not live long to see the battle won or lost, dying on the 23rd of April 1016 on St. George's Day. His son Edmund succeeded him as king and would become known as Edmund Ironside for his tenacity in attempting to push back against the invading Danes. At least 5 battles were fought over the next few months, but by October 1016, the Witan convinced both Edmund and Cnut to meet and broker peace. An agreement was reached that Edmund would take Wessex and London, and Cnut would take the rest of the country. Whether or not Edmund was planning to change this by force, we can never know, as a month later he died on the 30th of November. Contemporary sources make no mention of murder, although sources written over 100 years later do suggest it. He could easily have been murdered, but equally died from wounds in battle, or even just a disease or illness. But the way was now clear for Cnut to become King of England, even voted in as such by the Witan. Up until this point, the existence of Emma is virtually silent. It is believed that Emma and her children went to Normandy upon Ethelred's death, but it's also possible that Edward, Goda and Alfred were received by their uncle Richard, but that Emma remained behind. Whatever the case, it wasn't long before Cnut sought her hand as his wife. He was already married to Ælfgifu of Northampton, but at this time it was considered acceptable to put aside a first wife who had been joined through a pagan ceremony in favour of a second wife in a Christian ceremony, normally for political reasons. Ælfgifu of Northampton remained in Scandinavia, while Cnut's marriage to Emma was purely to keep hold of England. It was a symbol of continuity from the previous regime of King Ethelred, and it would also discourage her brother Richard, Duke of Normandy, from aiding the claim of her 2 young sons, Edward and Alfred. Cnut also had 2 sons from his existing marriage, Harold and Sweyn, but Emma was promised that they would not be allowed a claim to the throne of England if she gave birth to a son. Although their relationship began as a political arrangement, it was apparently an affectionate one, as detailed in the Encomium Emmae Reginae, an encomium written in honour of Queen Emma. However, this text was written with a view to providing praise for the reign of Cnut, as well as his marriage to Emma and the stability this had brought to England, and so was unlikely to be anything but complimentary. But several other sources from this time seem to mention both Cnut and Emma, also acknowledging the fact that they needed each other to maintain the peace in England. Emma also had 2 more children with Cnut, Harthacnut and Gunhilda. A period of relative peace seems to have fallen over England at this time. Cnut was able to pay off many of the Danes who had followed him, leaving just a smaller force standing in England, and his marriage to Emma also ensured peace across the Channel with Normandy. Emma herself also had a raised position at court, as she was far more important to Cnut than she had ever been to Ethelred. However, there was a dark undercurrent to Cnut's rule. Ethelred's other son, Eadwig Aetheling, and Edmund Ironside's 2 sons, Edward and Edmund, all fled into exile for fear of their lives. Cnut had Eadwig killed on his orders. Only Emma's sons were kept safe under the protection of their uncle Richard by her marriage to Cnut. By 1018, his elder brother Harold had died, and Cnut also became King of Denmark, and by extension, Emma was now also Queen of Denmark. In 1028, Cnut then set his sights on Norway, having previously heard of discontent amongst the Norwegian nobles against their king, sending them gold and silver to gain their support. He set off for Norway and deposed Olaf II Haraldsson, sending him into exile. Interestingly, Cnut here placed his previous wife, Ælfgifu, and their son Sweyn as regents of Norway as he himself returned to England. This may have been to satisfy the desire on their part for Harold to hold a high position, but their regency was unpopular and collapsed after a few years. Their ambition without a kingdom was later to cause problems for Emma. Cnut's reign came to an end when he died at Shaftesbury on the 12th of November 1035. Emma was now probably in her mid-50s as she became committed to securing the English throne for her son Harthacnut, as had been promised. This probably would have gone a lot smoother if Ælfgifu of Northampton had not returned to her family's lands with her son Harold, who made a competing claim. Emma had been Queen of England for many years by this point, and had been made to put aside the claims of her sons by Ethelred under the promise that Harthacnut would claim England's crown on his father's death. She was not about to be pushed aside. At least the Encomium Emme Reginae states that Harthacnut was to gain England, but as it was written for its patron Queen Emma, this may not have been the whole truth. Other chroniclers of the time were divided on the issue. Some agreed with Emma. Others thought Harthacnut was to gain Denmark only. At the time of Cnut's death, Harthacnut was in Denmark and seems likely to have been there for some time. Therefore, this would have undermined his mother's attempts to hold the throne for him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that the nobles north of the Thames gave their support to Harold, but Emma was to hold Wessex and London for Harthacnut. It's probable that if Harthacnut had bothered to come back, the kingdom would have been divided between them. But he didn't, as he was held up with protecting Denmark against the new ruler of Norway, Magnus I. Harold was accepted as the new king of the English in 1036. But Emma wasn't content to accept events as they were, and she was likely responsible for encouraging her sons Alfred and Edward to come to England from Normandy and invade. It was a disastrous attempt. Edward, the younger brother, tried to attack along the south coast but had to retreat. Not long after this, Alfred Etheling landed in England, but the Encomium states that he was duped into appearing before Harold with a forged letter, supposedly sent by his mother. Harold condemned Alfred to be blinded with a hot iron, and Alfred succumbed to his wounds not long after, dying in 1036. We cannot know Emma's personal feelings on the loss of her son in this way, but she must have felt grief at the manner in which Alfred died, especially after she had gone to such lengths to protect them after their father's death. Emma had no choice but to flee England, making her way to Bruges in Flanders. It was here that finally, in 1039, Harthacnut turned his attention to England and his mother's plight. He came with a force of 10 ships to Bruges. Given confidence by a vision which foretold Harold's imminent death, by March 1040, the vision came true, leaving England without a king. Harold may have had a son, Ælfwine, but the evidence is scanty. Regardless, no one was likely to argue with Harthacnut, who by this time had gathered an invasion force of 62 ships, and after envoys crossed the Channel to offer him the throne, he came to England's shores in June of that year. Harthacnut's reign, however, was to come under heavy criticism. In order to pay for the large fleet he brought with him, heavy taxation was placed upon the people of England, always an unpopular move. And at least 2 versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles state that, in a deplorable move, Harthacnut had Harold I's remains removed from Westminster Abbey and flung into a marsh. On top of this, when people refused to pay his large taxes, Harthacnut would send his army to torch the villages, removing what booty they could. But in 1041, he sent for his half-brother Edward to make his way from Normandy to England in order to secure him as his heir. Cnut was unmarried at the time and had no children, and it's suggested by some sources that he suffered from an illness. This may be the truth, as Cnut was only in his early 20s at the time, so this would otherwise be an odd move when he still had plenty of time to make heirs. It's also possible the move was suggested by Emma, who would have wanted to maintain her position through keeping a son of hers on the English throne. Not long after this, Cnut died at Lambeth on the 8th of June 1042, collapsing while drinking at a wedding. Edward was now king, and was crowned as such in April 1043, and would later become known as Edward the Confessor, returning the throne briefly to Anglo-Saxon hands. Emma, now a powerful political force, wealthy with both lands and ecclesiastical properties, would not fare as well as she had before, however. In November of 1043, Edward removed much of his mother's goods and properties, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle remarking, "This was because of her lack of helping him both before and after his crowning as king." Although Emma later seems to have reconciled with her son, even recovering her previous position at court, Winchester never recovered its importance, and the centre of regal rule was transferred to London, where it would remain evermore. In 1052, having lived a very long and eventful life, Emma finally died on the 7th of March. She was buried beside her second husband Cnut and her son Cnut at Winchester. But her legacy would live on for many more decades, leading to one of the most important events in English history, the invasion of William the Conqueror. Her marriage to Ethelred and her sons Alfred and Edward living under the protection of Richard, Duke of Normandy, would open the door for later Norman nobles to claim England as a possession. This was strengthened when Edward the Exile, the son of Edmund Ironside, died in 1057. King Edward had no children, although he was married to Edith of Wessex, and so this left a problem over who would take the kingdom when he died. Due to his blood ties to his Norman relations, Edward decided he would hand over the succession to his cousin, William, Duke of Normandy. Emma's marriage to Cnut also contributed to the tense political situation, which led to years of bloodshed and successive kings after Cnut's death. Emma's character, like so many distant queens in history, is difficult to figure out. Some of her actions, such as sending her sons Alfred and Edward to the safety of Normandy after their father's death, and her support later of Cnut, could speak of a dedicated mother. But some of her other actions also suggest a woman whose primary aim was to maintain her own position, encouraging her sons to invade when it would suit her, and possibly not doing enough to help them when it didn't suit her. But whatever the case, it cannot be denied that Emma of Normandy was one of the most visually and politically involved royal women of the early medieval period, and her prominence at court influenced many decisions made both by her husbands and her sons. Her connection to Normandy was also the basis for the claim William the Conqueror would later make, later histories of the event always starting with Emma's marriage to Ethelred. Emma was certainly a queen who made her mark, ensuring her story would not be lost to history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.